for our first panel discussion. Money in French, we say, c'est le nerf de la guerre, and it is in these challenging times, money is really, really an important issue. And we are talking about huge amounts of money. So to talk about financing and where the money should go in the multilateral perspectives, we have a very distinguished panel who will be discussing all this. So let me introduce them to you while they sit down. Ambassador Beatrice Mazer, who is head of the Economic Development and Cooperation Division and a member of SECO's board of directors. Ms. Mazer is also governor in several regional banks where she represents Switzerland's interest. Ms. Mazer strongly believes that the official development assistance should be used in a way to leverage additional resources for climate finance in developing countries. Ambassador René Orellana, head of the Bolivian delegation at the United Nations Conference on Climate Change in 2012-2013. Mr. Orellana is the former Bolivian Minister of Environment and Water, a position he held between 2008 and 2010. He's also professor at the University of La Cordillera and a researcher in environmental issues. He has published several books on the topic of climate change and poverty. Mr. Nick Beglinger, founder and CEO of the Zurich-based Foundation for Global Sustainability, as well as president of the Swiss Cleantech Business Association. His current focus areas are economic policy, innovation, as well as strategic and financial planning in the areas of climate energy, urban planning, and mobility. And he has some very specific ideas on how to finance the impact of climate change. So before we start our discussion, we will watch a short cartoon which explains the first theme of our discussion around the amount of money allocated for climate change.
The United Nations has calculated that the sum of $100 billion will be needed each year from 2020 onwards to combat the effects of climate change. This sum seems enormous, more than any organization is lying around waiting to be used. So where does this money come from? One part is ODA, the official development assistance. And the rest? It is not as it needs to be printed or unlocked from Treasury. The money needs to be collected from different sources so it can be distributed accordingly. Aid must therefore become increasingly strategic in creating effective development partnerships. Also, new sources of financing, which are not based on traditional aid, need to be accessed, for example, from the private sector. Once the funds are assembled, they need to be allocated effectively where the impact is highest. Aid needs to be targeted towards the poorest and those who face the greatest difficulties in raising alternative financing. Aid also should be allocated in a predictable, accountable, and transparent way.
So that's a big topic. We're talking about a lot of money, and I'd like to start with you, Ms. Mazer. $100 billion, it seems like such a huge sum, but is it really such a big amount to allocate to climate change?
Well, I'm not a lawyer, but I would say it depends. If you ask the people who have to finance that amount, the ministers of finance, for example, they will all say, well, it's really a huge amount. On the other hand, if you look at the challenges, it looks to me that it is rather ambitious. If you look at the needs, you really need enough money to address the issues. That said, you will have to join forces between the different actors. You will have to bring in the public and the private sector working on this jointly together. And you will also have to join forces between developed and developing countries. So we saw in the cartoon that ODA will play an important role in financing part of the challenges associated with climate change, but ODA alone will not be enough. So let me just mention one sector, which is the private sector, and I'm sure my neighbor to the right will explain how he sees the role of the private sector.
Okay. Mr. Orellana, should everyone contribute to this amount, or should we just impose a tax on the rich countries and use it to finance these measures? What's going to be the role of the poorer countries?
Thank you very much.
It's working, don't worry.
Okay. Thank you. Initially, thank you very much for this invitation, and it's a pleasure to be with you all. Well, this is an important issue to be discussed. In fact, the question about where this big amount seems to be big But if we compare this amount with other amounts spent in military budgets, for example, or subsidies to agriculture in some developed countries or countries with big economies, well, it doesn't seem to be so big. So we expect in the line of the Convention of Climate Change that these resources have to come from the countries that have the capacity to provide them, mainly developed countries who have to provide these financial resources to contribute to the actions of developing countries, mainly the poorest one, in order to adapt to the climate change, to the climate crisis. When I say, and this is very important, if we compare, when I say let's compare this amount with those amounts that is spent, for example, in wars or in military strategies of some international organization, it doesn't seem to be big. The budget of the NATO, the transatlantic agreement of developed countries, is $1 trillion a year. So 100 billion is not too much compared with the amount that is spent in military activities nowadays.
No, I think we would all agree with you on that point, but what's going to be the role of the poor countries? Should they then just receive the money and not participate at all?
Poor countries are already now spending money in order to adapt to climate change. In fact, they are already making a lot of efforts adapting to climate change. Think about what they do when they suffer the impacts of extreme events. Recently, Philippines was very hardly hit by typhoons, for example, and they are using their own national resources. Last year was Brazil, before was Pakistan. My own country is spending a very impressive part of the budget in order to restore the economies damaged by by extreme events. So we are doing our part, and it is important to recognize that. And of course, international cooperation has been very much important, supporting our own efforts.
Okay. Mr. Beglinger, you represent the private sector on this panel, and you have an idea on how to raise this money. First of all, do you think it's a huge amount? Do you think it's a...
Well, no, I think the question whether it's a huge amount or not is an easy one. It's not, obviously. Mm-hmm. If you look at some of the figures, US alone, one country spends more than 6 times that amount on its defense budget. One fossil fuel company like Shell has a turnover of $450 billion. So more than 4 times or what we're talking about. No, so I think you could even look at it from one point of view. You could say it's peanuts. It's very small. I think the question whether it's enough, and more so than the question where it should come from, maybe leads us to some of the solutions that have thus far not been found, and maybe could provide a breakthrough and a new thinking as to how this needs to happen. And I think that goes into the direction of the shift away from the country, or the developing countries versus the developed countries, if you want, more towards the market, and more towards a market, though, that works differently than the market works right now. Because I don't think the 100 billion from a ODA point of view, from an aid point of view, yes, that's a lot. But the 100 billion from an investment point of view, that's not a lot. So we have to get the market involved, and the way to do that, in our view, is pretty obvious. Everybody has been speaking for years now that there needs to be a price on carbon. And I think that's exactly what is needed now, a price on carbon. So we are very much proponents of a global CO2 tax that provides the market with the necessary framework to make the sustainable rather than the unsustainable solution in the market profitable. And then what else needs to be financed as in the form of a total package, then can come in the form of ODA, which could also be financed through some of the rewards from a globally applied CO2 tax. This is as to where we see the solution.
Ms. Basser, what do you think about this idea of a tax to fund climate change projects and to alleviate the impacts of climate change?
Well, the money has to come from somewhere, and as it was mentioned, it comes from different sources. But I would like to build on the point that my neighbor made, and highlighting the importance of the private sector coming into this equation. And since I'm representing ODA, development assistance activities, I would like to highlight that ODA will play a part, but will try to contribute to unlocking the private activities by, for example, lowering the risk, or by providing financing to lower capital costs for new technologies that have yet not been proven. But by no means I would like to suggest that we go through subsidies, but it's really more of an incentive that we can provide with ODA.
Okay, I would like to get your feeling quickly also on this tax, this idea of a tax, Mr. Orellana. What do you think? Is that an idea that appeals to you?
Well, first of all, I think that we have to have a provision of an integral package of means in order to support adaptation actions. That means to adapt to the climate change in poor countries, in developing countries, and also to make efforts of mitigation, reduce and limit the emissions of gas in developing countries. It is not only markets or privates who are going to provide the necessary means for this challenge of adaptation and mitigation. We have to have an integral package. That means technology transfer, that means finance, that means capacity building, as the Convention on Climate Change says. Taxes is something that we have to discuss carefully. What kind of taxes are we talking about? This is something to be clarified. There was a discussion in the Climate Change Forum about the possibility of creating a tax over transfers, financial transfers in the world, and this source could provide around $600 billion per year, which is bigger than the one that has been quotations committed by 2020, which is 100 billion. If we apply taxes to goods, this is something different. I mean, goods produced in developing countries, this could imply, for example, certain impacts on their economy. So we have to try to understand that it is necessary to have a package of means in order to contribute structurally to adaptation and mitigation contributions and actions.
Okay. Mr. Beglinger, if you can just react on that. After, I would like to get on to the next chapter of our discussion.
Think, there's 2 points I'd like to share. One is I don't think there should be a first of all we do the aid and then we do the market. I think that notion is wrong simply because of the fact that we don't have enough time left, and because of the humongity of the greatness of the problem that we have.
The urgency.
The urgency, the time, but also the size is very significant. So we have to move in parallel, and therefore I think, starting with the Ban Ki-moon summit this coming September in New York, Switzerland, or if it's not Switzerland, then some other country should come up with this point that a global CO2 tax, as has been introduced by Switzerland already, should be part of the discussion again, to make the market work better and also to mobilize the funds necessary in time. But maybe the second point, we experience Switzerland is going through a change in energy policy right now, and we're experiencing something similar here. The question whether government, the best role for government is to go and see what's good and then finance what's good in terms of aid or in terms of subsidy, or whether government should listen to science and hear what's bad and start taxing the bad so that the market can start working the way it should be working, the way it sustainably, that it can work sustainably. And that's really a pretty fundamental different way of looking at things. And we believe because companies, technology, innovation always happens faster than regulation, the regulation really needs to concentrate on the science that is proven and that is there, price carbon, and let the market work out which technology is the cleanest, which solution is best in which country.
That brings us to the second part of our discussion, because we're going to talk now about the smart use of aid. And before we continue, we will watch a short cartoon on this aspect of our discussion.
For aid to be sustainable, it needs to be smart. Smart use of aid means leveraging other financial resources effectively in order to fight poverty. Developing the local private sector is one of the means to generate significant resources. Thanks to a grant from Switzerland, a small business may be able to invest in a machine and with that multiply its production. This can in turn allow a small business to expand, to buy more machines, and to hire employees. A higher quality product that is affordable meets the local demand, ideally also at regional level. Small businesses flourish, creating new opportunities. Opportunities for small enterprises, such as for the transport sector. It also creates opportunities for local investors. A dynamic private sector, buoyed by strong entrepreneurship, creates jobs and increases domestic revenues. All this can be promoted by fostering a good business environment for companies, for example, to facilitate access to credits.
Okay, Mr. Beglinger, we've just seen an example of how private investor rationale combined with sustainable development in developing countries seems to work. Is that smart aid for you?
Yeah, totally. I think the way Switzerland approaches this problem is to a very, very large extent very good. What we're saying is that we have to move a step beyond and be more ambitious in our country goals and propose innovative solutions at global level. We're kind of too reluctant. But what is done in terms of ODA certainly makes a lot of sense to me. The only thing that I think needs to be added, if a small business is supported in a particular local market and the framework, the regulatory framework of that local market is not conducive to sustainability, well then that small business will not be successful with its sustainable product. So, I've done work in different countries where the government heavily subsidizes energy, and it's darn difficult to put up a case for energy efficiency if energy is almost free. So I would say, what Switzerland is doing great, but maybe the transfer of know-how should also happen on the regulatory front, so that smart regulation, as we have it partially in Switzerland, should also be part of what is transferred into a particular market, so that the framework conditions of that market are then sustainable, and then a small business that is supported can live and operate profitably within that correct framework.
Ms. Mazur, for you, what is the smart use of aid?
Well, I'm afraid I'm going to be very boring and sort of concur with my neighbor that we think leverage is very important. We use ODA as leverage so we can unlock other sources of funds. And also in regards to the policy framework, I fully agree with you. If we employ ODA funds, we have to ensure that the framework conditions in the recipient countries, in the developing countries, are so that the funds are really going to deploy their full effect. Now, in addition to leverage and policies, in ODA, we really try to be results-oriented. So we want to maximize impact with the funds that we obtain. And you have heard that we just presented the climate effectiveness report, where we actually track whether our measures that we finance with ODA, they produce the desired results. We will also have to focus on the needs. Where are the needs the biggest? The developing countries most affected by climate change. And then maybe as a last point, again, as we already said, private sector approaches, market-driven approaches, in order to ensure that we have a most efficient and effective utilization of the rather scarce funds. So what we want is most value for money.
Mr. Orellana, climate change is an international problem, but with very local effects. Should we just give the money to local governments or communities to invest it as they want? Is that the smart use of aid?
Well, first of all, let me say that we do not have to lose attention of the central elements of the agenda of climate change. It is not market nor business, the central elements of climate change agenda. So if we concentrate our attention on these issues as if they were the engines or the promoters of the conditions for adaptation and mitigation, we are not in the correct path, I would say. A smart financing is not something to be defined by experts or scientists. Maybe the concept is not smart, if that is the sense related to science and experts. is communities, peoples who are suffering the impacts of climate change, who are giving us calls and are asking for attention to certain needs that they have in order to be planned and put into the agenda. The satisfaction of these needs to be planned into the agenda of adaptation and mitigation, mainly adaptation. If you think, for example, that 1.5 billion peasants live in small farms that are between 1 and 6 hectares, you can clearly understand that the demand of these people that find jobs in the land, in the agriculture, is precisely to create a resilient agriculture. We have to listen to them and not to define their necessities from outside, thinking mainly on market or business issues, but thinking on their demands related to adaptation in a context of climate change. This is very much important to be said. On the other side, privates, we have to define what is private. In this cartoon, we see people, small or medium companies or enterprises of people making, I don't know, investments. Well, this is one kind of private. Are we talking of this kind of private? Is this private in the sense we want to give them in terms of supporting their initiatives? Well, if this is the discussion, we have to concentrate our attention on these initiatives coming from the people and the expectations coming from the people in the ground.
So, Mr. Beglinger, what's the private sector's role? The climate change we hear is not a market, it's not a business. It's not its role to replace public money. So private sector wants to make money, they want to make a profit. How is that going to be compatible and work?
I think it's very easy. I mean, if a company wants to and should make money, that's the objective of a company. But the company is subject to the regulatory framework of a particular market it operates in. If that regulatory framework demands the company, in order to make money, to be sustainable, then our solution is solved. Which means in terms of climate change that companies need to face CO2 legislation in all the markets they operate, so that they, out of market reasons, out of profitability-seeking reasons, adopt the low carbon rather than the high carbon solution. And therefore, I totally disagree with your first statement that, you know, if we're on the market track, we're on the wrong track. On the contrary, I would argue that every other track, apart from that market track, with the exception of ODA, locally and, you know, where it is still necessary, basically filling up the patch, with that exception, it must be the market. And not because, you know, I'm a free market enthusiast. Many people in Switzerland know me as pretty much the contrary. Actually, it's a bit ridiculous, but, you know, a company needs to operate within a framework, and it's the government's job to make sure that framework is right. So I see a huge and important role of the government. It is to set that framework right. If we are not looking at the market, and, you know, of course, you 1.5 million small farmers, they're not in global business, but global crop prices do dictate their profitability. So, you know, this all is today in a globalized world entangled together. And if we only look at this 5 or 10% of the market as we've been looking thus far, then we're totally on the wrong track. That's why, my last statement, that's why I, for example, dislike very much the term impact investment. Why? Because obviously every investment has an impact. Those speaking about impact investment, they suggest, usually private bankers, suggesting that their clients to spend maybe 5 or 10% of their funds into impact investment. Well, the 90% that flows otherwise also has an impact, but maybe a negative impact. And we need to make sure we're on the 90 or 95% scale of sustainable investment if we want to solve the problem of climate change in time.
Ms. Mazur, climate change has become a core issue. When you hear Mr. Beglinger, how can the private sector be involved if it's to make money? Is that not the antithesis of aid, which is what we're also trying to do at the same time?
Well, no, actually, even though I'm sitting in the middle, I would be, I'm much closer to my right-hand neighbor, in the sense that aid has a specific, objective, which is to support good framework conditions. Aid is not there forever. We'll have to ensure that at some point, the developing countries, in this case, can finance their own needs, that the financing becomes sustainable, and aid is only there to help providing the right framework conditions. And then at some point, if you really want to have sustainability, you need market-driven approaches in order for it to be sustainable in the long run.
That point has been yesterday. I mean, we need to do it now, immediately.
Urgently. What's your reaction to what you're hearing, Mr. Orellana? Because obviously it's not quite what you are telling us.
Okay, let's see the behavior of the private investment, international private investment, to see what are the trends. If you see the investments of foreign direct investment of private companies, for example, in research and development, do you know how much of that investment is going to research and development in Africa? 0.4%. 0.4%. To Latin America, 7%. So research and development, which is one of the priorities related to climate change, coming from private investment, international one, is going to certain places where markets are interesting and has important potentials for revenues. So I'm not saying the private is good or bad. This is not the discussion about what is good or bad. It's what we have to do in order to strengthen the capacities, the resilience of communities, of ecosystems in a context of climate change, which is the central element in adaptation. And in mitigation is how to create conditions so that developing countries could contribute to reduce, limit their emissions and decarbonize their economies. So these last elements implies not to say that private or market is going to solve everything, but to define the necessity of having predictable and sustainable provision of financial resources, as one of the cartoons has said. We all that are part of the United Nations have decided to create a Green Climate Fund, a technology committee, an adaptation committee, a technology center, etc., which are part of the universe of institutions created in the United Nations. We have to strengthen those institutions so that they could act as promoters and supporters of the process defined nationally by the peoples and the countries in order to strengthen their capacities for adaptation and to build a path for mitigation. It is not the market per se. We need, of course, as you have said, regulation. When we say regulation, we're talking about the priority of the role of the states and the publics, the local governments, the social organizations who have to direct and to plan their own paths of climate change and adaptation and mitigation, and also, of course, in development and poverty eradication, which are very much linked.
Mr. Beglinger, you wanted to react?
Yeah, I just wanted to, 2 quick points. I mean, one, I think it is not correct to say that for solving climate change, the main issue is research. I think that would paint too bleak a picture. Today we're in a situation where, Siemens says about 70%, we tend to say about 80% of the technology needed to solve our emission reduction path to 2 degrees, or not to exceed 2 degrees warming. 70 or 80% of the technology is available today. It's not a question of having to invent it, it's a question of simply having to apply it. And the other point I wanted to make is it's not a question as to market versus government. If that was your opinion, then I haven't expressed myself correctly. That is what I call sort of the green economy sort of paradigm shift. Before, a lot of private sector representatives would have told you, oh no, we don't want any taxes, we want as little rules as possible, we do our thing, the market will regulate it. And that's not what I'm saying. I say we want as little rules as possible, but I do say there is a hugely important role by the government. And unfortunately, governments are not fulfilling that role right now, today. If you look at where the money is flowing right now, we've got 6 times more fossil fuel subsidies than we have subsidies for renewable energy. So governments around the world, if you take the simple figure, are promoting the wrong thing instead of the right thing. So I do want governments and the market to solve the problem. But the way to do that is not to say the government needs to spend all the money. The government needs to say where the money is invested. The government decides which technologies are good and which technologies are bad. The government must make the frame, and the companies can do the rest. And if we have this sharing of interest, then you have the private sector stating, give us rules, give us a price on carbon. Then we know where we're going, and we can plan our investments, and I think that's the only solution for meeting our targets in time.
Okay, we'll now move on to the third part of our discussion around the threat of climate change on the progress that has already been made. And before we continue, let's watch a short cartoon to illustrate that part of our discussion.
To fight poverty, it is crucial to provide basic infrastructure. Its construction and modernization is key, as well as the promotion of sustainable use of the natural resources. Switzerland's focus is on water supply, waste management, energy, and public transport. Streets and bridges bring people together and allow the exchange of goods and services. People can interact with each other, products can be brought to the next marketplace, which can offer more volume and variety. Children can go to school, and citizens from remote areas have easier access to a workplace. Developing countries suffer the most from the consequences of climate change that include drought, storms, and other extreme weather events. Climate change, therefore, increasingly threatens the development achievements that have been accomplished in the past and those to come in the future.
Mr. Orellana, it's a rather pessimistic view. Developing countries suffer the most from the climate change, and the little progress that has been made can disappear because of the consequences of climate change. So what's the answer?
Yes, some studies says that if the temperature increases in more than 2 degrees, let's say 3 degrees, around 70 or 80% of the costs of the impacts are going to be in developing countries. And the fact that developing countries are very much vulnerable is precisely due to poverty, due to the conditions of development, due to their exposition to the impacts of climate change. And developing countries are not, we cannot say they are not doing anything in that sense in order to adapt or mitigate. The developing countries are making important efforts. Emerging countries also, of course, they have better conditions, better capabilities, but other less developed countries are also investing in adaptation and mitigation. But they need to be supported with initiatives like the one we have heard and known before in the presentation that was made by the authorities, for example, of Swiss cooperation. This kind of cooperation has been very much important in order to strengthen the capacities of communities and to solve local necessities of peasants and indigenous and workers. So this is something we have to stress. And let me also underscore, let's not lose our sight about who are affected by climate change. Who are affected? Not the companies, it's the people. I have read recently this interesting book of Mr. Thomas Piketty, which is called The Capital. The Capital is very famous now. And he has, precisely in his book, shown that despite the fact that growth is, GDP is decreasing in developed countries and in some developing countries, the rate of revenues and the rent, I don't know how to say in English, of capital, the revenues, has been increasing in certain owners of these big companies. So they are not the ones, companies, to define the necessities of people. It is communities. It is the people who define. This country is very impressive in its experience of consultation, for example. I have known that in Switzerland the referendum is something very famous. So this is a kind of measure or instrument or tool in order to consult the necessities of the community. So let's put that clearly. Who is the affected is who have to have the voice in order to ask and to give opinion and proposals about the ways to be followed for sustainable development, poverty eradication, and adaptation and mitigation in climate change.
Ms. Mazur, can progress and growth be climate friendly?
Yes, absolutely. I mean, it depends on how you do it. Development cooperation takes the new challenges into consideration. I mean, Switzerland has been active in mitigating greenhouse gas emissions and also providing support for measures to increase resilience and the adaptation capacities of developing countries. I mean, we have seen examples here, and you will hear about them throughout the day. So what is important is we need economic growth in order to reduce poverty, which is the objective of development. But we need sustainable economic growth, and we need climate compatible growth. So this is an absolute must to preserve livelihoods. Now, let me give you a specific example. We have been talking a lot in very general terms, maybe a more specific example where through the efficient use of valuable natural resources and the creation of new business perspective, we can actually improve the living standards but also reduce poverty. It's a project in Vietnam where we try through a sustainable development of the natural ingredient sector to create economic benefits for the people. You have been talking a lot about the people. It's the people in the end that will have to take action, indigenous people or rural people. By making the values that the forests produce saleable, so that you have, for example, fruits or other plants where you can use pharmaceutical products afterwards, where you can export some fruits. This is a value created through the forest, and the local population has then an incentive to work in the forest, to protect the forest against deforestation and degradation, and at the same time the local population has a new business where they can improve their income. So it absolutely goes together that you can protect the climate at the same time, you know, grow and have business activities. But it needs a little bit of thinking to bring these two aspects together. And this is where ODA comes in to sort of foster these new and innovative approaches.
Mr. Beglinger, what is your view on the problem that climate change threatens hard-won progress? Does it undermine the foundations of future growth for you?
Yes, it totally has the potential to do that. I think it's a very, very serious problem. It has the potential to undermine a lot of things and unleash a lot of terrible things. So I think it's a problem to be taken extremely serious. What I don't like so much is the differentiation between companies and people, because I think, you know, there's a differentiation to be made between companies and government, but I think people are part of government and people are part of companies. I mean, after all, you know, it's people that work in companies. So I think, you know, I'm totally with you that the developing world is where most of the negative effects are being seen, and therefore I am very much with you that developed countries need to do a lot more than has been done so far. That's also why we as an organization are currently lobbying the Swiss government to come up at Ban Ki-moon summit, but also ahead of the COP in Paris, to announce ambitious targets independent of whether any other country is doing that as well. We should be courageous enough to go out there and say we are a very developed country. We have been benefiting from so many things, including dirty tax money, etc., for so many years, that it's our absolute duty to come out and say, yes, Switzerland is reducing, let's say 60% by 2030, even though the others are not yet joining us. honestly, we're doing that also from an economic point of view, because we think that's the smartest strategy for Switzerland. We're such a high-priced country. We need to differentiate ourselves in the market with something like clean technologies. So there's even an economic thing behind that. But I'm with you that it's the developing countries that suffer most. I just think it has to be a joint effort, and I truly think it's the CO2 tax. Maybe together, we've been speaking before a bit, with a consumption-based approach. Right now we have the problem that Switzerland, you know, the energy-intensive businesses, they may go to some other country where the environmental regulations are not so steep, and nobody gains from this situation. And there is some thinking to be done whether really it's correct to have purely an emission-based approach, and whether we should not start thinking along the consumption lines, because if I buy a Chinese toy in a store here in Switzerland, it's really me that is responsible for the CO2 involved in producing that Chinese toy in China or in Bolivia.
But you want Switzerland to have sort of a spearheaded type of role on this. So tell us a little bit about that.
Well, you know, SwissCleantech was founded 5 years ago because the prevailing economic association in Switzerland was holding back on climate change legislation, and we just couldn't understand why this is the case. We think Switzerland, as I said, is a high-priced country. We have many great innovations in the area of sustainability. We were the first, starting with purifying all our water. We know well with waste. We have very smart garbage collecting systems, etc. And we have our hydropower, so we know about energy management. So we have a lot to offer, and we have that to offer in terms of an economic proposition, as well as in terms of development aid. So I do think Switzerland should be a leader what the climate change movement is concerned, and I do hope President Burkhalter will get together the courage and go to the Ban Ki-moon summit and state to the world that Switzerland is reducing 60% to the year 2030. I hope I don't get a nasty letter now.
Ms. Mazur, Switzerland does already quite a bit. You represent Switzerland in the Regional Development Bank, so what is Switzerland's interest in these institutions?
Well, the multilateral development banks have the same objective, which is to support the developing countries in their development, to reduce poverty, but also to take on the new challenges like climate change. And Switzerland, together with other donors, just thinks that we are better off joining forces. It's better to harmonize your donor activities. The multilateral development banks are very powerful because the recipient countries also sit around the table. They are also shareholders. They will also influence the policy. And together they have, as we call it, a convening power, convening all the different actors around the table and finding solutions which address the global issues.
We have about 5 more minutes, I think, in our discussion, if my timing is right. So I'd like to maybe start having your conclusions. I will maybe start with you, Mr. Orellana. What are your thoughts on what we've talked about? Because there have been very different points of views on this whole climate change and finance.
Thank you very much. Let me try to summarize. I think that it's important, I said at the beginning, to have an integral package of means in order to support process of adaptation and mitigation. This means to have elements which are very much important, like technology transfer, like capacity building and finance. That implies, of course, certain responsibility regarding developed countries in order to also share technology to open the doors to the access of that technology. We're not talking precisely about markets of technology. We're talking about transfer of technology and to strengthen the possibility and the capacity of developing countries to develop that technology. Let me put just an example. My country has an important regions in natural resources like lithium, and is making a very important efforts in order to develop the technology in order to use that lithium in a perspective of precisely changing our sources of energy in the future or diversifying it. So it's not easy to get the conditions and the support from external, in this case, some kinds of companies or some kinds of states of developed countries to support this kind of process. Just to put an example, we can use other examples coming from developing countries. So we have to strengthen these efforts, these initiatives, in order to develop precisely economies not based on fossil fuel in the future. And this needs a very strong leadership of developed countries here, not only fulfilling their commitments of mitigation, but transferring finance and technology to developing countries.
Ms. Mazur, I'd like to hear your perspectives in your conclusion.
Yes, from my perspective, representing ODA is part of the solution. We can employ it, but we need to employ ODA funds smartly, for example, to leverage additional resources, additional know-how, and additional innovation. But the second very important point, which I would like to stress, is that you have to have the right policies in place, the right framework conditions. You have to have the right institutions, which then actually ensure that the funds, whether they come from public or private sources, are being employed in efficient, effective way. So appropriate tariffs, internalizing costs are certainly also very important aspects in order to address this rather huge challenge that we have with the climate change. And I liked your point that you said we have to act now and not in a few years.
Mr. Beglinger, other than writing a letter to Mr. Buchhalter, what is your conclusion?
You already did that. No, well, I think really the most important things have been said. It's not, it's a huge problem. We have to act now, immediately. It's not government or market, but it's the combination. The governments have to be clear that without the regulatory frameworks inducing sustainability, the private sector will not be sustainable at the scale that we need it to be. And I think in the past, not many companies were keen to move into the direction of a clear tax. I think we're at a unique point in time now where some of the CEOs of some of the very largest companies in the world are openly speaking about a CO2 tax. And I think if we get our act together now, governments and companies, we can change maybe the system, and we all need to do that for the next generation that follows us.
Thank you very much, Mr. Beglinger, and I would like to thank the panelists for a very, very lively discussion. Thank you very much. I will now ask Anton Hilber to join me at this table. Anton Hilber is a negotiator for Switzerland on the climate change issues and head of the global climate change for SDC. Am I saying that correctly?
Yes, thanks
okay,
very much,
good.
Muriel.
Good.
This was a rich discussion.
Very lively. So what we've heard today, does this correspond to your negotiating experience and the discussions that you're involved in?
I have taken notes, but my notes are a bit confused. I don't want to
add.
add.
Show them to you.
I don't want to add to the complexities here. I think for those less familiar, it did give you a sense of the complexities we're dealing with in multilateral negotiations. I hope it's become a bit more clear, the thing with the 100 billion. It's from various sources. This is climate finance. Important remark that was made, aside from climate finance, we also have anti-climate finance. We have a 500, 600 billion per year in subsidies that go to oil, gas and coal consumption and production. These are mostly in developing countries. They're not targeted to the poor. The developing countries cannot really afford these. The money has to be used for other purposes. We need to help them reduce those. It's not easy, but essentially it's a waste of money and it hurts the climate. The alternatives, clean energy technologies, stand ready to be used, as Mr. Beglinger has very ably pointed out. With the panelists, let me just say Mr. Orellana, he is, like myself, a government official and climate change negotiator. I would call upon him to work together to now conclude this multilateral agreement next year. The complexity is enormous. We need to simplify. We need low carbon targets. We need to find the burden sharing geometry, and we need to organize adaptation assistance to the poor. So that seems doable. From that, we can then translate it into harmonized national policies on clean energy and national adaptation plans. So that's where, again, Mr. Beglinger then comes in. He is calling for what the private sector in North and South needs is simply clear rules, especially in the energy sector. That's where much of our problem is located. Clear rules that can attract investment. I was surprised and I could say pleased that he brought up the Swiss proposal that we have entered into these negotiations a few years ago, which is a world carbon tax. It's $2 per ton. The poorest countries are exempted. With this fully elaborated proposal, we could generate 50 billion per year. Of course, we should not wait for all countries to agree. That could be a long wait. Switzerland, I would also agree, is in a position to lead on issues. We have a project of ecological tax reform. This could be integrated, and we could pay into the new Green Climate Fund a non-ODA component that comes from the polluter pays principle. So I must say, on the negotiations, we still have homework to do. The Swiss offer on emission reductions for next year is not yet ready either. The banks, Ms. Maser was talking about, have a key role. It's the financial engineering we need. We need to reach the local banks there in developing countries to finance more clean energy. The Green Climate Fund now comes online. This negotiating process has spin-off products. They are created there, they're taken outside and implemented. We are now ready to finance. This is then outside the UN negotiations. It's already decided half of it for low carbon development, the other half for climate resilience, adaptation with a clear focus on the poor. So smart use of ODA, this will be mostly ODA, what we contribute to that fund. But with it, as has been pointed out, we want to unleash the other sources of finance, mainly private. Multilateral and bilateral have to work together. If we don't reach the ground and the poor people, it is not a good outcome. So in that sense, climate change finance is development finance. ODA has an important role to play in it. So to conclude, I would just say the agenda is actually quite clear before us. First of all, we do have to stop using the atmosphere as an open sewer. We have to put a price on the CO2. We have to break the link between the growth of emissions and economic growth. It's doable. Switzerland has demonstrated it as one example. We also need to think of the more than 1 billion poor people that still have no access to electricity. How we do this with low carbon technologies will make the key difference there. Conditions for private sector, North and South, to act can be created from the top down. A multilateral deal translated into national policy can be the door opener there, and we need to achieve it. So let me just say what also was not said here, but all the evidence points to it. The cost of not acting is increasing steeply all the time.
Just want to ask you one question about the threat to hard-won progress. What is your view on that?
Well, we all have seen the images. The Philippines were mentioned. More close to home, we recently had really serious impacts in Bosnia and Serbia. We have seen numbers on economic impact. The poorest always hardest hit. I was just reminded by the Green Climate Fund co-chair is from the Philippines. He has sent us detailed impact assessments with numbers. It is extremely impressive and disheartening, so the dangers are very clear. So again, then on the action side, I think what I've pointed out on the need for low carbon development and climate compatible development is what we have to strive for to address the impacts there.
Thank you very much, Mr. Hilber, for all your thoughts and for this synthèse of the discussion. Thank you very much.